All right. Well, first and foremost, thank you again for your continuing effort with this project. We're going on about a year officially. Our first big group meeting was March 1st of last year. So it's hard to believe it's already been that long, but here we are. And we have a list of questions in front of us, which is fantastic. So today I just wanted to go over quite briefly what I see as the next steps to give you all information about what's coming up next. There's no immediate task for you all. This is more of a preparatory session, and so that you can ask questions of me and chat with each other too. So I will try to keep this, as brief as it needs to be, because I know we're all busy. So I have about 10 slides that I'll go through quite quickly. The content in these slides reflects some of the conversations that we've been having over the last few weeks with people in general about the project. I know some of you have been in and out of those meetings too, so some of this will be familiar. And I guess this is just, kind of thoughts on how we'll get this to publication. So feel free to jump in and interrupt me as I talk through this. Let's see. All right, so you should all see my screen now. And I'm not going to be able to see everybody, so do just kind of give a yell if you have a question. All right, so here's where we're going. Just going to talk real quickly about deadlines here, and then kind of just what to expect with a few particular items. So the two important deadlines, one of them is mostly for me. That's March 11th. I am going to attempt to compile all of the feedback that we've been getting on the questions. I have 75 responses, so about half of folks completed the feedback, which was about about what I expected. I mean, it still means we have feedback from 75 people, so there is a lot of good stuff in there to extract. I am going to do my best to put that into a coherent and usable format for all of you, and I'll try to do that by March 11th. So that'll give me about 3 weeks. Until then, there's nothing that you all need to be doing, and I will try to get out that feedback as quickly as I can. So the date that's more relevant for all of you, I'd like to target May 13th. That's a Friday for a revision of the big questions, and that'll be based on the feedback that I send you. So go ahead and mark your calendars for May 13th. That's about 2 months to turn things around. And in addition to revising, I would kind of my stretch goal is to have drafts of text from all of your groups about your questions themselves. So remember, this is not a ton of text, just maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 paragraphs to briefly answer the question, why have we included these? What makes them important? Kind of briefly giving some of the process that your group went through to come to these questions. Something that did come up in the conversations was having some hints or ideas about how you might answer questions. Not necessarily going into detail, but some questions might be more appropriately answered with a meta-analysis or a data compilation. Some might require new data collection themselves. So just kind of very briefly how somebody might go about answering these questions. So what to expect? This is gonna just be the types of feedback that you're gonna get from me. So as I think most, if not all of you, have completed the form yourselves, so you're probably familiar with what the questions were. For every question, you will get an importance score. So everybody was asked to score questions from 1 to 5 for the importance of a question, 5 being the high score. On average, we were at about 4, which is pretty good with a standard deviation of 0.3. So I'm going to kind of actually use those as a bookmark. If we have questions that only hit maybe a 3.5 on average, those are questions that we'll give more focus to say, hey, the group maybe didn't think this question was as important as it could be, or as some of the others. So that would be an area to edit or to replace a question. So yeah, that'll be the first thing you get, is just a general score for each question. The second thing you get will be everybody's evaluation of whether or not the questions meet these criteria. We've had a lot of conversations about the criteria in particular over the last few weeks. And I guess to borrow from a movie, we're considering these more as guidelines than as strict rules. So these are not intended to be absolutely binding, just as a framework to help us develop the questions. So not all of these are necessarily appropriate to evaluate every single question. And as we can see from our example here, there's not necessarily agreement across the board anyway. In some cases, there's more than others. So, if we go to the second example, 75% of people who evaluated this question said, yes, it meets all the criteria. And then a few other people had other opinions. So unless there was something very specific that jumped out of this feedback, we would probably go ahead and say, okay, yes, this more or less meets those criteria. This previous one, you'll see that it's criteria number 7, answerable with yes or no. A lot of people said that this was a yes or no question. So in that case, perhaps I would encourage the group to rephrase their question so that it is not answerable with yes or no. So there's variability in these. We do have some more explanatory things here. So this is the type of feedback that I will try to compile and give to you in, kind of as acting as an editor, to give you kind of touch points for each question. So again, the criteria, we're just using them for our own means. They were developed by the Sutherland paper for conservation biology. So it's not a one-to-one match for our type of work, just something to use as a tool. Probably the biggest area that we'll need to work on is the overlaps. So for every question, people were asked to identify if there was a substantial overlap with another question. And this is representative of the feedback that we saw. So you can see far fewer responses for questions like these, maybe only 5 to 15 responses. Here we have about 10. So where you can see these unique numbers for each question, we have EER1, BD3, BDST3. Those are places where I'll go and pull those out, send it all to you and say, okay, here's where there was overlap. Some of the feedback won't be as useful as others, but that'll kind of generate our network of overlaps. Here, there weren't necessarily any repeats, but in some groups, for some questions, there were more clear overlaps than others. So to address these, this is where I think starting to have the text around these questions will be important. And this is something that we heard again in those conversations the last few weeks. Two groups may have produced a question that looks similar, but the context for why they developed that question might be very different. So seeing some of the text around these will help to distinguish the questions. And that's where also, where we have these stronger overlaps, I will be trying to coordinate meetings across groups. So trying to actually have people discuss those during the period from March to May while we're revising questions, to finally have a few group, maybe it's only 2 or 3 people total, to have these conversations, say, okay, well, we posed this question. This was our intention. What was your intention? Okay, they are the same. Okay, great, we can condense them. Or maybe they're not, and then you can rephrase to distinguish them. For broader input, I'm really going to try to encourage people to use Slack. I know not everybody is a huge fan, but with a group this size, it's just, it's one of the most readily available ways to engage so many people asynchronously. So I'm going to encourage conversations there, but anything that goes into Slack, I will try to distill out to groups as well, if it's, just so that we're not missing things across communication channels. Okay, the last point on framing, this mostly came out of the meetings that we had. And if you've seen the Slack channel, this was a question that came up there, of how general or specific we should frame questions. A common piece of feedback that we've seen on the questions is that a lot of them are very general, so that they're almost not answerable, perhaps, in the next 5 to 10 years. So in some cases, we'll probably be moving towards more specific questions, and that's the type of feedback that I will try to give to you as I evaluate the 75 responses that we got. But in general, I think the consensus was to move towards somewhat more specific questions. So breaking apart longer questions and adding a little bit more detail. And again, I think this is where having some text around these questions will start to help understand how people thought about them. Another point to reiterate is that we want these to be future looking, and we don't want to be repeating the past. This is, again, another piece of feedback that came up a lot. Some people felt that some of the questions posed had already been answered, or that we were just kind of regurgitating things that were decades old. In some cases, that's probably okay. There are open questions in paleontology that we've been trying to work on for a couple decades. So again, that's okay, but we do want the most of these questions to be looking at future avenues and not reflective of where we've come from. And okay, again, I'm sounding like a broken record, but some of the text around there could also be useful for that, saying, okay, new analytical approaches have enabled us to address this question in a new way, or new data have come to light that can help us. The last suggestion that had come out of these meetings as well was to try to group some of the questions. There certainly are themes within the working groups themselves. 2 or 3 questions that kind of go after the same idea. And also grouping broadly across the working groups. An idea, again, that came up several times was of adding a tag or almost a thematic identifier that we could use across groups. So, you could have a question and questions that come from 3, 4, or 5 different groups that each have the same tag on them that would say, these address the common thematic area, but they're specific to these different working groups. So this would be a way to show that these ideas are networked, because of course these ideas are all interacting with each other in one form or another. So just something to have in the back of your mind. That's not something we're going to move on right away, but something that we'll likely be looking at moving forward. Okay, that's everything that I wanted to tell you about what's coming. Just give you a sense of what type of feedback you're going to be getting, a general idea of how we'll proceed with it. I, of course, will encourage everybody to be scheduling meetings with their groups, and I will probably be playing a more active role in doing that. If you recall, I sent out in December, or it was June, December, a feedback form, and we did get actually about 100 respondents to the feedback form. And one of the common pieces of feedback was that people wanted a little bit more top-down structure and a little bit more cohesion. So I will probably be a little bit more annoying to all of you, or more persistent, I guess, in my communications, just to keep us moving forward, to try to keep things cohesive. So I will be a little bit more hands-on, not terribly so, but just to get this project over the finish line as best as we can. Okay. That is now everything that I intended to say. So happy to have any questions or any conversations that any of you have interest in. Unless everybody's just like totally happy. Okay, Rachel's got one.
Well, no, I mean, you kind of, I guess you answered it already, but did you get a sense that there would be a lot of work in rewording the questions? Or, I don't know, did we do a good job? I guess is what I'm asking.
People seem happy on average. I took the importance score with an average of 4. I was actually quite pleased with. There's a lot of difference of opinion here and there, but I think we'll probably actually the biggest area for editing that I see, well, there are two. Groups who had fewer questions, I think, will more likely be asked to expand those out to more specific questions. And then I think we'll probably drop about 10 questions from duplication. So I think in general, people were relatively happy with the questions that came through. And those were the two biggest pieces of criticism or feedback that I've seen so far. So I think overall, it's good.
Jansen, what are you thinking about, or just number of questions at the end for each group? Are we still in the 8 to 10 range, or whatever it was before?
Yeah, I think, I think I had said like 8 to 12, just to give some room. I think that still is about right. I think we had between 4 and 16 for this. So a few groups are going to be trimming a little bit more. A few groups maybe will be expanding ideas a little bit more, but yeah, right around 10. And again, some people have talked about like, it'd be nice to get to a nice round number of 100 for the final paper. And while I certainly see the appeal of a round number, I don't want to make an arbitrary choice between two questions just for the sake of getting to a final number. So it's flexible, but let's aim for 10-ish. Another idea. Oh, go ahead, Rachel.
No, I was just going to ask if you've been having fun.
Some days, yes. No, this is the fun part. It's nice to like see the list and actually like read through all the reading through everything has been quite upbeat in general. People have been quite positive, so that's been really nice. One fun idea, speaking of fun, that has come up again a couple of times during this conversation for the last few weeks was to have a more visual interactive component for the questions as an end product. And this would be more for outreach, it'd be separate, I guess, but like an accompaniment to the paper that people could use to interact with, maybe to look at more of these overlaps. So that's something that we'll also be looking at as well to make this more engaging than just a traditional manuscript.
You could hire a scientific illustrator to produce some really nice graphics.
That's a good idea. I'm gonna have to check with Wolfgang about our budget because that would certainly be better than I can produce. Although I guess FAU is gonna have a new person on board soonish, right? So